Coming up, the heat was brutal in the Northern Hemisphere during summer 2024. In the southern winter too.
Ay, de lo peor, mis animales, mi casa.
Nosotros estamos respirando un aire con deficiencia de oxígeno.
And an American icon celebrates another birthday.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Smokey Bear turns 80, loved by some for his gravitas and fire prevention message. A controversial figure to others.
What goes through your mind when you see people celebrating Smokey Bear? And what kind of harm do you think he's done in the last 80 years?
Those two messages of both suppression and fear of fire are definitely something that are not part of Indigenous cultures or societies.
Just 2 Degrees is on. Now.
It's like a prevalent reminder of the disregard the US has had for Indigenous communities. Do they not care about how people feel?
Wildfires, they're happening more often, spreading farther, burning longer. The situation fed by hotter global temperatures. But these forest flames aren't always a bad thing. When set deliberately and controlled, they get rid of dangerous fire fuels like dead branches and leaves, and they help soil rejuvenate and ecosystems recover. Although it's pretty hard looking on the bright side when uncontrolled wildfires cause so much destruction.
Brazil's Pantanal, one of the largest wetlands on the planet, parts of it are now a burned and barren landscape. The biome faced unusually severe wildfires this year, with more than 3,000 outbreaks between January and June, more than 20 times the number recorded in 2023.
Então, negócio que esse ano chegou mais cedo, né, o fogo. Chegou mais cedo a seca.
And it did. Local authorities say Brazil is facing its most severe drought in history, with more than a third of the country seeing extreme conditions. Bolivia, too, has experienced some of its largest fires in more than a decade, with 3 million hectares already decimated and the peak fire season still ahead. In the U.S.'s lower 48 states, the 2024 summer was abnormally hot.
Oh, you live here? Yeah. I'm sorry, man.
With record temperatures in Phoenix, Fort Lauderdale, and Redding, California. Across the country, at least 30,000 fires have been reported, laying waste to more than 4.5 million hectares. And further north, Canada saw 5,000 wildfires this season, with over 5 million hectares torched. Is the second most destructive season in the past 20 years. Drone footage in an Albertan town shows 30% of the homes and buildings destroyed.
I'm one of the fortunate ones that seems to still have a house, but there's a lot of people in this town that have completely lost everything.
The boreal forest is usually about 20 degrees Celsius in the summer and typically experiences fires once a century. But this year, increased wildfire activity affected Alaska and eastern Russia.
And so if we see these kind of big changes where fires become more common in the boreal forests, we might not see as much carbon taken up from these natural ecosystems as we expect.
And in southern Europe and North Africa, extreme temperatures and drought led to mass evacuations across Italy, Tunisia, and Algeria. And there were twice as many wildfires in Greece compared to 2023.
Εδώ πέρα η περιοχή ήταν γεμάτη πράσινο, πάρα πολύ πυκνή βλάστηση. Δεν υπήρχε κανένα μέτρο πυρόσβεσης, παντού ξερόχορτα, αριστερά και δεξιά. Είχαμε ζητήσει από το Δήμο.
Well, the US has been using a fictional character to teach young people how to avoid starting forest fires accidentally. Smokey Bear has been an iconic symbol for decades and turned 80 years old in August. But his message hasn't always been well received. particularly from North American indigenous communities who say Smokey's old tagline, "Only you can prevent forest fires," was problematic.
Who was not the sort to give up easily?
In the early days of fictional pop culture icons, bears were all the rage. Winnie the Pooh, Yogi Bear, the Care Bears, Paddington Bear. But when it came to raging forest fires, the bear that bears remembering is the one and only Smokey Bear, also widely referred to as Smokey the Bear, with his famous slogan,
"Remember, only you can prevent forest fires."
In 1944, something else was raging, World War II. America's tinder supplies were seen as critical for the war effort. This led to concerns that enemy attacks would cause forest fires, for good reason. In 1942, a Japanese submarine fired on a California oil refinery near Los Padres National Forest. While the attack did little damage, it sparked paranoia over the possibility of much worse. Smokey was the brainchild of the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Wartime Advertising Council. Dressed in a ranger's hat and blue jeans and holding a shovel, Smokey made his first public appearance in a poster created by artist Albert Stahl, a friendly yet authoritative figure. His slogan spread like the wildfire he warns about. His image and prevention tips appeared in public service announcements,
Friends, don't play with matches,
parades, classrooms, cartoons, lunchboxes, and more. But Smokey's campaign was perhaps a little too successful. In 2001, U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service researchers acknowledged that decades of aggressive wildfire suppression ignored the importance of natural wildfires that kept forest growth in check. More forest meant more fuel for future fires to spread. 2001 also saw Smokey's slogan change.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Updated to recognize the threat of climate change, not just to forests, but to grasslands and other ecosystems. And his messaging changed to promote the prevention of unwanted fires.
But not everyone has fanned the flames of Smokey's fame. Indigenous peoples have used fire carefully for centuries to control forest overgrowth. But in the early 1900s, the US government policy to prevent wildfires actually outlawed that practice and ended up making forest fires worse. I called Indigenous writer and environmental historian Dr. Rosalyn LaPier to tell us more.
I saw Smokey Bear's 80th birthday message. It goes, quote, "For decades, I've taught you everything I know, how to safely build a fire and how to control the flames." Is that true? Did he really teach America these life lessons?
I think he did, in terms of modern America, for sure. I mean, Smokey Bear is a 20th century creation and is still very much part of American culture into the 21st century, something that children learn about in school and see, and Smokey Bear is, just very prevalent in U.S. society since his creation 80 years ago.
What goes through your mind, though, considering the history of this character and what it's suppressed in the past? What goes through your mind when you see people celebrating Smokey Bear? And what kind of harm do you think he's done in the last 80 years?
That's a great question. So Smokey Bear, one of the main messages that Smokey Bear has had for the last 80 years is the suppression of fire and also the fear of fire. And between those two, those have been taught to school children, for generations now, and also to the general public at large. Those two messages of both suppression and fear of fire are definitely something that are not part of Indigenous cultures or societies that have been part of, what is now the United States for thousands of years. So Indigenous people don't think of fire as something that is dangerous or something that should be feared, but they think of it instead as something that's useful, that's a useful tool, as long as it's managed correctly. And it's something that Indigenous people have been using for a very long time. And again, thousands of years as far as we know, in terms of the historic record.
I know in 2001, I believe it was, the organizers, the owner, the trademark owner of Smokey Bear, tried changing his messaging a bit from the use of the words forest fires to wildfires instead, basically acknowledging that controlled burning was good. Did that at all change your feelings toward the character?
Well, I don't know if I'm correcting you or not, but I might be. So when they changed the messaging, so they changed it from, suppressing forest fires to suppressing wildfire. The Forest Service itself was acknowledging that there were fires that happen in the US, for example, prairie fires, for example, fires that happen in Florida. So places where you would not think of places, or in California with the chaparral, places that are not considered forests. And they were trying to share the message that it's not just when you're in, a forested area, but other places as well. There's the potential for a wildfire to happen. So I think that was kind of the change of messaging, was not just forest, but other places as well. It isn't until very recently, in the last this current administration, that there has been an effort to think about Indigenous ways of managing land and landscape and the use of anthropogenic fire or human-created fire, cultural burning or prescribed burning on the landscape. That's been a very recent addition to the Forest Service's thinking about how to manage landscapes and how to manage fire.
I'm thinking about the pain this character would have created. I know the US in its history has created lots of cartoon characters, I guess, that have been sexist, racist, to some degree, to a great degree, for some of them. Why not just get rid of this character altogether and create a new character with a good, pure new message that is all inclusive?
I think in this particular case, again, it's been around for so long. I don't think of people thinking of this particular cartoon character, and he also, is a kind of mascot. So he comes to events and stuff, as a ginormous.
But he's like a prevalent reminder of the disregard the US has had for Indigenous communities. Do they not care about how people feel?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, the message is still the bottom line message that Smokey Bear shares, again, mostly with children, but with communities, is both the suppression of fire, like suppression of all fire, and then also the fear of fire. And I think, again, those two messages are messages that the Forest Service can and probably should tweak, so that they're teaching people that fire is not something that necessarily you need to be afraid of, and that it is something that, again, Indigenous people have used and utilized for a very long time and don't have that same level of fear that Smokey Bear is teaching people. And in fact, there are a lot of Indigenous cultures, Indigenous communities in what is now the United States, where they usually have some kind of origin story or story about where fire came from, and it's usually a good story. It's not a nightmare. It's usually a good story of sharing how fire was introduced to humans, how humans can use it, how it's something that's useful for us, and again, not that same kind of fear factor that the Forest Service shares as part of the Smokey Bear message.
As we mentioned earlier, forest fires can be a force for good. The beneficial use of fire in the wild has been practiced for 12,000 years in parts of the global south to grow food sustainably. It's known by many names: lading in Southeast Asia, milpa in Central America, and chitmene or tavi in Africa. These are just a few. But But Swidden, or slash and burn farming, as it's known in the West, has become a controversial approach for complicated reasons. Lars Lovold is a social anthropologist who's done long-term field work in the Brazilian Amazon.
Do you like the term slash and burn?
I don't particularly like the term slash and burn because it has been used in a very negative sense. Of course, it describes what people have been doing for generations and generations in the tropical rainforest. That means opening a small field by cutting down the trees there. And you do that before or early in the dry season, and you let it dry. And then just before the rains, in principle, you put fire on that. And then in the ashes, you plant all kinds of foodstuffs.
I know you don't like the term slash and burn, but would you say that these techniques are harmful at all to the environment?
That depends on certain circumstances. I am an anthropologist. I have been working a long time and living with indigenous peoples in the Amazon, in the Brazilian Amazon. And actually, the Amazon is what it is, partly because of shifting cultivation, or what is called slash and burn, because people have been living there for thousands of years. They have practiced this agricultural method of opening small fields, putting fire to it, and then planting in the ashes, using it or planting there for a couple of years, and then leaving it to regenerate.
How does fire help the soil regenerate?
First of all, an intact tropical rainforest doesn't burn. So when you have cleared that small plot, which is the family garden, it can be 50 meters by 60, 50 meters by 65, etc. It's a relatively small thing. When that wood has been drying for a couple of months in the dry season, it used to be 2 months. Now it's longer because of deforestation. If you put even a high fire on that plot, it doesn't spread into the tropical rainforest, even after the dry season. This phenomenon of fires spreading into the forest is because of climate change and deforestation and opening up the forest. But an intact rainforest doesn't burn. So that's even quite amazing. The ashes are nutrient rich. So when you plant in those ashes just before the rains, and in the old days, climate was much more predictable. So people would actually then have, cassava, bananas, sweet potatoes, all kinds of medicinal herbs, maybe tobacco, etc., etc. These small plots or gardens were extremely rich in diversity of foodstuffs, maybe also some medicinal plants, as I said, etc., etc. And when they leave that area after 2 or 3 or 4 years and open in another area, if population density is low, which it has always been in the Amazon, then they will only come back to that area in 30 years, 40 years, etc. So specialists, ethnobotanists, they can walk in the Amazon rainforest and see people have lived here generations ago. The amount of fruit trees are higher than normal because people also planted, things that grow and stay. So people will come back to old plots, both because they have fruits there, or maybe it's a good hunting spot, because also monkeys or pigs, wild pigs, they love the same fruits as human beings. So it's a way of living sustainably in the Amazon rainforest and using it in a way which is adapted to the extreme diversity of that biological and ecological system. You cannot concentrate in the Amazon on a few things like corn or maize only. They cultivate corn, maize, but that's just one of many, 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 many things. So the diversity and the sustainability of that system has actually led to we as Westerners coming to the Amazon, almost believing it's a virgin forest, a jungle not touched, etc., etc. But that's not the case. It's an area that has been inhabited for generations and generations and generations. But the modern way of doing agriculture there, that is really harmful. That is, cutting down the trees for large areas and not letting it regrow. And that destroys the Amazon.
The small-scale farming, as you put it, and shifting cultivation, you don't like the term slash and burn, but in the past, big money corporations and foresters have called this type of agriculture called a backward type of practice. It sounds racist. Why is slash and burn so demonized? Is it just a money issue and these big companies just want to control all agriculture?
I mean, people call it primitive and backwards, but it's actually a very scientific way of approaching a forest, given that you have large areas and low population pressures. My area of work has been a lot concentrated on the Amazon, and those have been the conditions. Now, maybe in Central Africa, maybe in Southeast Asia, slash and burn in high population density areas where you cannot allow that rotation to really take place so that actually the nature regenerates, then it becomes a problem. But it has not been a problem in the Amazon. What is the problem in the Amazon is modern agriculture, monoculture, cattle ranching. That is the huge problem that is destroying the Amazon. But what has maintained the Amazon is exactly that rotational system, which people have called slash and burn. Of course, the emissions from the fire, you can call that a CO2 emission. Of course, it's a CO2 emission, but it's a very, very small area. So the system itself has been sustainable. And in the Amazon, like, let's say 50 years ago, when destruction was less from the modern forces, that's the Amazon that the indigenous peoples have maintained, used, lived well in. And I mean, I have been so amazed because I work for the Rainforest Foundation Norway, and we are working closely with local communities in the Amazon rainforest. And for instance, when I visited the Kayabi Indians in the south of the Brazilian Amazon in Mato Grosso, the old man started giving me peanuts, groundnuts, he had 22 varieties. I have never, tasted any kind of peanut or groundnut with that kind of taste and that size and everything. And he managed 22 different varieties. I mean, we are working with some people up in the upper Rio Negro, close to the border with Colombia, the Baniwa people. The Baniwa people have 75 types of chili. I mean, and they distinguish between all of them. Some are good for that fish, some are good for that. And now they can even dry that and sell it to sort of gourmet restaurants in Sao Paulo.
And that's the show. We leave you with pictures of a world that seems to be on fire, from the Pantanal region and the Amazon forests in Brazil to the dry grasslands of Bolivia, the smoldering landscapes of Europe and Canada's vast forests. The impacts of wildfires on communities and ecosystems cannot be understated.